in the way that you have done in so many ways, actually. You've just provided more than we're ever worthy of, and you've cared for us and provided so much. We're thankful for that. We know that there are some folks who are having some struggles right now with their physical health, some who are struggling with emotional or psychological needs, and others who are suffering spiritually. We're praying that you'll help us to see where we might be able to assist and do what we can. We thank you for your word and for its direction. Thank you for loving us like you do, caring for us, and just ask you to be with us, help us to be mighty in our service and faith, and help us to reach out to others. We're praying in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we introduced the subject last week, and tonight we're going to, actually, as I mentioned, they're going to spend the next 5 weeks, we're going to talk about different mountains in the Bible, because there are so many amazing things that happen on the mountains a lot of times, or in the shadow of mountains. And so we're going to talk about that, see if we can't better ourselves in learning along those lines. But also what I want to do is just let you know the format of what we're going to try to do is go through. I'm going to look at some things historically with you, tell you a little bit about the mountain first, like it's on your handout. Go through historically what happens on that particular mountain, or at that mountain. Oh, I wonder why the website. It is on YouVersion if you care to follow it on your phone. I thought I put it on there. But what we're going to do then after we do that is just kind of throw it back to you and say, okay, what do we learn from this? What's some application that we can make from studying this mountain? I talked with the guys that met with us on Monday night and said, one of the things that's critical in doing Bible teaching or preaching is to give application. Okay, so what does it mean for me? What does it mean for you when we leave this place, so that we can remember, even 36 hours after a sermon? What did I preach on? Jed, what was it? Doubt. And Jeffrey, what was the main point? Listen to the voice of God. Now, I just want you to I tell you that now, because I had 11 men in that room, and not a one of them could remember it. So it's very humbling to preach. I just want you to know, 36 hours later, that they couldn't remember at all what the point of the sermon was. We're going to let you develop what the points of the sermon or the class are tonight. So first of all, we're going to talk about Mount Ararat. And as you can see, it's located in eastern Turkey, and it's just south of the Armenian border. Throughout time, it's been claimed by a variety of nations. Russia claimed it for many, many years. Armenia still claims it. In fact, it's on their coat of arms. And so they claim it's their mountain, although it's actually physically is located in Turkey. And it's close to the Iranian border, close to the Armenian border, close to Russia. That's the Black Sea that's up there to the left, the top left. And of course, we've been seeing the north side of the Black Sea a lot for the last however many months or so, with the Ukraine and everything else. So you have at least a general idea of where the mountain is. Ararat's the very first mountain that's mentioned in the Bible. And as I've got here in your notes, that it reaches a height of 16,854 feet. So it's pretty good size. It's often snow-capped and often snow-covered. There's a little bit of the history on it of how it's exchanged or going around from nation to nation that you might have there that you could look at. But here's a picture, and you can see in the foreground there is the city Yerevan of Armenia. So you're obviously looking to the west to get that, and you see, what do you see about the mountain? It's snow covered. What else do you see? Yeah, there's two mountains. So there's actually Mount Ararat and Little Ararat, as it's called. So that's what the topography looks like. There's a much better up close view of, you can see both of the peaks there. Uh, Very beautiful. You can go hike that if you want to. They have all kind of um, companies that will take you up and let you hike. Um, that's probably beyond what I'm going to do. Um, but anyway, it's a number of companies, a lot of people that are hiking. You can see pictures, people up on top of the mountain and everything else when you look through it. But the most well-known thing about Ararat, of course, is this is where Noah and the ark, this is where the ark landed on Mount Ararat. And so that's why we're going to look at it here. Look at your handout. I think it's in there. It is evident from the scriptures that God designed and created a moral universe. When Adam and Eve sinned, they were punished in Genesis chapter 3, verses 9 through 19. When Cain sinned, he was punished in chapter 4, verses 9 to 12. And it's very evident from the scripture that it is their fault, and God holds them accountable for that. And it's a moral world. It's a moral universe that God created. There's a right and a wrong. This is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're not supposed to do. So from the very beginning, God has had that situation as far as this world. But as is the course with morality, it often just continues to slide. And in the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis, beginning in verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man on the earth, and I will destroy, man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. That's a tremendously harsh statement. And we're only in the 6th chapter of God's book. Genesis alone has 50 chapters. And here you are barely into reading. You've just had creation. Okay, wow, look at the majesty and the power and the might of God. And immediately this situation falls. Sin enters the picture. And it not only enters the picture, but it so permeates mankind that God looks and just says, I'm sorry that I even made man. So what's the moral condition in our country today? Yeah, I mean, so in what way? I mean, give me an example of how you think that society is, or the moral condition of our society. Huh? Yeah, but I'm talking about some specific. What specifically are you saying then that it's so bad? Okay, guy. Okay. Okay. All right, George, you were going to say something. Okay. Yeah, I mean, businesses used to recognize, I mean, they were closed on Sunday, and I mean, you had a lot of things that were, I remember my mother telling me the town she grew up in, a small place, but she said that there were 2 or 3 different pharmacies or drugstores, as they were called, and they took turns as to which one would be open on Sunday because, you might need medication. But I mean, there was a certain aspect that just kind of permeated society. But it's not only those things, but how far is it going now in our country? It's not even just that they're there. Steve? Okay, that even sounds biblical. Yeah, you're right. Okay, Carl, you were going to say? Okay, yeah, so that's really where I was going with this. It's not even just homosexuality, but morality that's now being legislated as far as being acceptable behavior, endorsement, protection for certain things that used to be, it was, as Paul would say, that's a shame even to talk about those things that you wouldn't hardly even talk about. It certainly wouldn't in a mixed company, in an open setting, and now it's just, bam, thrown in our face that not only is it okay to do that, but you better accept them, and you must do this, and you can't do that as far as this kind of lifestyle is concerned. So Noah and his family, it says in chapter 6 and verse 8 of Genesis, found grace or favor, your translation might say, in the eyes of the Lord. And because of the righteousness, they would be saved from the destruction of the Lord. So God instructs Noah to build this ark for his family's safety. And it says in chapter 7 and verse 1, come into the ark, you and all of your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. And then in verses 6 and 7, Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So Noah with his sons, his wife, his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. So let me ask this question. How long had Noah been working, or we don't know exactly how long he worked on building the boat, but how long had he been preaching? It's between 100 and 120. Okay, between 100 and 120 years that he's preached. In chapter 6 and verse 3, we're told that he was 500 years old when he had his kids. He is 600 years old now when he goes into the ark. And chapter 5 and verse 32, and in chapter 7 and verse 6. Chapter 6 and verse 3 talks about that as far as this period of time. So this cataclysmic flood comes on the earth. I mean, I realize I'm preaching to the choir, telling you guys a lot of this. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The earth breaks up. The floods were on the earth for 40 days. The waters increased, chapter 7 and verse 17, lifted up the ark. It rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed greatly and increased on the earth. The ark was moved about on the surface of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all of the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. Now, did this literally happen, or is this just what is oftentimes referenced as being the exaggeration or hyperbole that historians write with? Okay. Yeah, it literally happened. It wasn't just a bad storm. Okay. I mean, it wasn't even a hurricane in the sense of, oh no, some flooding. I mean, you know, all of us have seen houses covered in water. I mean, but we haven't seen high hills and mountains covered in water, fortunately. God said he wouldn't do that again in that same way. But this cataclysmic flood comes along. And then after 5 months, the ark finally comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Chapter 8, verse 1 of Genesis. Then God remembered Noah. Had he forgotten Noah? Had he forgotten Noah? So what does it mean he remembered it? What? Well, okay, but I mean, it says he remembered Noah and every living thing of the animals that were in the ark. God, forgot all about them. Huh? He did, you're right, but I'm saying, did he forget God? Did he forget him? So what does it mean that he remembered him? Yeah, he brought it to mind. I mean, he brought it up, gave consideration of this situation. I mean, don't let somebody jumble up your thinking. This is some of the things that people will say sometimes in trying to disprove God. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. The foundations of the deep and the windows of the heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth. And at the end of 150 days, the water decreased, and the ark rested on the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat, or the Mount of Ararat. So, 150 days, 5 months have passed after the 40 days, apparently, and 40 nights of rain. So, then they finally come out of the ark. You know, actually, if you add up all the numbers and whatever, they are in the ark for almost a solid year before they step out on solid ground. Um, we sometimes think, oh, a month, 40 days, 40 nights, you know, that'd be a nice vacation, right? You're out on a boat ride for a month and a half. What a nice boat ride to be on. No, I mean, this goes on for almost a year that they are in this ark before they step again on solid ground. So, all right, that's the story. I mean, the story maybe is the wrong word. That's the incident. That's the historical event that happened on Mount Ararat. So, what are some principles or some things that we can learn from this mountain event? Okay, trusting God. Okay, all right, trusted God, took him at his word. Whether he understood it or not, we're not even sure of that. Uh, okay, I want you to build an ark. I want you to build it like this size, this way. Cover it with bitumen or pitch, and this is how it's going to be. And start going around, get these these animals, and put. And you're right. There's no argument that he. Are you sure about this, Lord? You know, couldn't you do something a little different? Uh, I mean, nothing. It is a matter of trusting God. Okay. What else can you? Huh? Yeah, that would have been nice if the no-see-ums had not been along. Mosquitoes. I could think of a few things actually that. But anyway, okay. What else? Yes, sir, Richard. Okay. Okay. I mean, I'm sure that was a pretty mammoth job to do that. I would like to think that his three sons were helping him as well. I mean, Noah's 500 years old. His boys are about 100. Um, but they get busy working, and of course, they didn't have power tools, and they got to go fell trees and make some kind of aspect of lumber out of that and bring it up. Okay, Steve. Okay, yeah, that's a tremendously heavy point, but you're exactly right of how we could say mankind in general, but how I personally can can fail God to such a degree. Yeah, yeah, right. Right, and the grief we should feel that kind of heaviness when we engage in sin, rather than just, oh well, you know, whatever. I mean, right, yeah, exactly. And here you have the massive humanity. I mean, he preached for 100 to 120 years. How successful was he? He saved his family, and that's the greatest thing that he could have done. If I could save my three sons, he has three sons. If I could save my three sons and their three wives and myself and my wife, I'd feel pretty successful. Um, but from a preacher standpoint, to preach for 100 to 120 years, and basically everybody just says, "Nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm not changing. What are you talking about?" But you're right. Okay. So what else? Yeah, Jeffrey. Okay, that's exactly right. So we see both sides of it, that God is grieved over sin, and to the point that he says, I wish I hadn't created man, but God says, you can be blessed, and if you just obey me, you will be. And so there's some great point there. Um, what else? Can you think of something else that we ought to learn from this, be able to? Drew? You're talking about Noah. Oh, okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, that he was focused on what God wanted. Okay. Um, now, I mean, we could talk about God keeps His word. God says, "This is what I'm going to do," and He did it. And then, in fact, after it's all done, He said, "I'll never do it again." And so, what do we have to prove that? Yeah, rainbow. Okay, I'll prove it to you. I'll show you that that's not the thing that's going to happen. I think it's a great point too that we can walk with God. We can find favor and grace in God's eyes. We can walk with Him. Noah does. Noah and his family walk with God. It's not just, oh, this horrible mass of humanity. Here is a man and his family who stand out because they walk with God. They're in fellowship with God. We can say God sees how we live. God sees what's going on. He sees what's going on in our life and so on. All right, so let's move. You got the idea. So let's move on. We're going to talk about Mount Moriah now. Mount Moriah is, we don't usually know of it quite as well, but where do you see that star on there? Where is that actually? What city is there? Jerusalem. Jerusalem sits on top of Mount Moriah. Okay. Now, Mount Moriah is not much of a mount. Okay. It's kind of a rolling hill. It gets up to an elevation at its highest at 2,549 feet. Mount Dora is not quite there, but Mount Moriah means chosen by the Lord or chosen by Jehovah. It's not just a single peak. It's a elongated range, as I've got there. And of course, one of the most recognizable architectural elements in all of the world sits atop Mount Moriah, which is the Dome of the Rock. And so that golden dome, I mean, it's seen, it's known, recognized by a gazillion people. Now, there are two major events that happen on Mount Moriah. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and promised he and his wife, Sarah, that they would have a child. And at the appointed time next year, the child was to be the recipient of the wonderful promises of God. And of course, that just sounds like that's an impossibility. Genesis chapter 18, is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of the life of Sarah, you shall have a son. And then dropping down to chapter 21, beginning at verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken, for Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born unto him Isaac. Now, what two other occasions had Abraham tried to move God's promise along? We're usually familiar with one, but not with the other. There are two things that Abraham tried to do to move it along before he had Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael. Okay, so he has now relations with his wife's handmaid, has a child, Ishmael. Okay, he's the one, and God says, no, he's not. Okay, but preceding that, there was another occasion. Do you remember who it was? What? No, it was his own personal servant, Eliezer of Damascus. And he said, I want to make Eliezer, he'll be the one. And God says, nope, it'll be one from your own loins. So then Hagar, Ishmael, nope, you and Sarah. And now it is Isaac, this child that you're going to have. So then the unthinkable occurs, because God tells Abraham, he said unto him, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountain of which I will tell you. There were days I was mad at any one and all three of my sons. But I just can't imagine the weight of this kind of a statement being made to a person. Go take your son, your only son, the one whom you love, and go take him up on Mount Moriah, and I want you to sacrifice him. What else would be involved in this offering Isaac? I mean, first of all, you'd have to do what? Kill him. Then what do you have to do? Gut him. And then what do you do? And then you light him on fire. That's unfathomable. And yet, Abraham readily obeys. Abraham rose up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son, and with the wood and the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took out the knife to slay him. How could he have done that? Yeah, he did it by faith because, I mean, it goes back to what we said before about trusting, what William said about trusting God. And it makes no sense at all, right? I mean, from a human standpoint, does this make any sense at all? You finally get your son, and God said, yeah, he's the one. And now God says, take him up on the mountain and kill him. And on the way, his son asks him and says, hey, Dad, I see the fire and I see the wood. Where's the sacrifice? And, I mean, how did Abraham answer that question? I mean, he says God will provide, but how do you answer that question when you've just been told you're the sacrifice, son? So they go up, and the angel of the Lord intervenes and stays Abraham's hand, prevents him from killing his son. And it says in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 12, this interesting statement, now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son. I thought God knew everything. Yeah, but it says, now I know. He didn't say, now you know. Huh? He what? Okay. 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 All right. Maybe it was, oh, go ahead, Doug. Doug? Yeah. Sure. Okay. Yeah, because he knew this is the promised child. I mean, this is the one through whom the blessings are going to come. So, I mean, he did have that faith. And I can only think as a father that might make it a skosh easier. But I still, just the whole thought of how much faith he had to readily offer this and say, if I do, God can raise him back up again. But I wonder if it's not maybe something along the lines, too, of the situation like when we have Satan and Job. The Lord knew what kind of faith Job had, right? Because God's the one who said, how about my servant Job? When the Satan said, I'm looking all over, I'm trying to find some, and he said, how about my servant Job here? And so Job's faith was beyond a shadow of a doubt to the Satan and to Job. It showed this to be the case. And that would be the same thing here to some degree, and that goes along with what Drew was saying. It did show to Abraham, but God said, now I know. Now I know that you wouldn't withhold anything. So finally Abraham looks over in the thicket. He sees a ram that's caught there. Abraham slays that ram in chapter 22, verses 16 to 18. Yes, sir.
He doesn't know. Maybe he chooses not to know that I will overcome that temptation today.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
He does not know, or he does not choose to know. And is that possible?
Yes.
Know if Job would be part.
Sure. That is absolutely, yeah, that's absolutely possible. That sometimes that state, I mean, I believe that God chooses not to know things. I mean, and so that could be very well what's going on here with Abraham, that he chooses not to know. I have a hard time conceiving of that fact from a human standpoint, but God can do what God chooses to do. So if he chooses not to know something, then he may not have known this situation. Right. Right, right, right. Right. That right. I mean, we don't have answers for some of these things. It is a matter of saying, here's what God wants from me to do, and that's what I need to do. Um, it scares me when I study the book of Job, because Job is so good. What we typically think in our world today is he's so good, what's God going to do? Build a hedge around him. In fact, that's even what the Satan said. God will protect him because he's so good. But he's so good, God says, hey, how about him? If I can say, I don't want God to know me that well. I know he does. But to be able to say, hey, how about testing Jody? I'd rather him know somebody else's name at that moment. Okay? And this is what Job goes through. But Abraham faces this mountain of trial here. But he passes. All right, second incident, just quickly, is Israel's King David had conquered many foes, and his kingdom was experiencing peace and comfort from the many battles that they had won. And at this time, David calls for a census of his people. Apparently, he wants to take a census. And it says, then Joab gave him the sum. 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 5. Joab gave him the sum of the number of the people, and all of Israel had 1,100,000 men who drew the sword, and Judah had 470,000 men who drew the sword. And God was displeased with this thing, therefore he struck Israel. So why was God mad? He had commanded a census, just about a year earlier, and they were to do a census then. So what's wrong with this census? Okay, they were counting, but I'm saying he had asked for a census before. Okay, what would be the basis for this census? Why does David call this census? Yeah, but it is of his strength. Look how strong we are. Okay, I mean, it was more of a trust in men than it was a trust in God, and so God is displeased with this. And so David recognizes his own responsibility in the matter. He asks God to forgive him, chapter 21 verse 8 of 1 Chronicles. God consents to forgive David and gives him an offer of three choices and says, okay, you choose which one. Do you want 3 years of famine, 3 months of enemy persecution, or 3 days of the Lord's sword punishing you? You get to choose, David. David said to God, I am in great distress. Chapter 21, verse 13. Please let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercies are very great, and not let me fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel died. Because David took a census. Before the plague wipes out the city of Jerusalem, God stays an angel's hand, and the Lord instructs David to buy the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite, and there to build an altar to make a sacrifice. And David does just as he's instructed. And the picture is really quite graphic of an angel who is ready to slay, and God steps in and stops the angel. For no, don't do that. So the Lord commanded the angel, and he returned his sword to his sheath. Chapter 21 and verse 27. So who does eventually build the temple of God? Solomon does. Why doesn't David get to do it? He was tremendously successful, broadened the kingdom in amazing ways. Why doesn't he get to? Yeah, he's a man of war, the Bible says. And God said, no, it's going to be somebody else. Solomon began to build, chapter 3 of 2 Chronicles. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite, and he began to build on the second day of the second month of the 4th year of his reign. So, how did this come about, this building of the temple? Was this just all David's thoughts and David's plans? And now Solomon takes over? I mean, had this been planned or thought out before? Okay, but I'm talking before David. Had there been a plan all along? Yes. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 5. Look at this. But you will seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all of your tribes to put his name there and his dwelling place there, and there you shall go. All the way back in Exodus, God had a plan. He would have a central place for them to worship. God knew what he was going to do. This wasn't just hey, let's build a house for God. Let's build a temple. This would be a nice spot over here. That's not how it came about. At the completion of the temple, listen to what Solomon says as he addressed the people in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 4. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has fulfilled with his hands what he spoke with his mouth to my father David, saying, since the day that I brought my people out of the land of Egypt, I have chosen no city from any tribe of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there, nor did I choose any man to be a ruler over my people Israel, yet I have chosen Jerusalem, that my name may be there, and I have chosen David to be over my people Israel. So that's on Mount Moriah. That's where you see the Golden Dome. All right, so what are some things that we learn from looking at Mount Moriah and the men who go up on Mount Moriah? Okay, that gives me hope, and you and everybody else. I mean, to think that it's not a matter of, well, you messed up, Ed, when you're out, or you can never be pleasing to me, okay? But there also, the other side of that is there are consequences. And David's sins, as well as him being a man of war, kept him from being the one who got to build the house. Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he still is a person that God reads the heart, not just the physical act or in the moment. Yeah. Okay, what else? Okay, yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just Genesis chapter 18, verse 14, and a really important point to remember. So what else? I mean, is there anything else that we learned from this? Always death associated with sin. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so there, well, yeah, but I mean, but But we live in a fallen world, and there are consequences to my actions or yours. If I get drunk and get in the car and drive and go crash into something, that wasn't fair that I hit somebody and killed 3 people in their car. But here are 3 people who died because I got drunk, drove in a car and hit them, or whatever. I mean that somebody breaks into a place, shoots up, and kills people. I mean that's not right. That's not fair. But you're right. That is what happens. And so sometimes the innocent suffer because of the sins of others, and that's certainly what happened with David. Yeah, guy.
The whole thing is looking back to when thinking that superficial.
Right. Yeah, yeah, that's a good thought, as well as us being here tonight, sitting here, being a part of a church family, is not just well. There are nice folks here, and so I like to associate with nice people. So, no, I mean it's part of God's eternal scheme of redemption set before the world was ever created. That's a great thought. There's threads that run through all of these things, and we ought to need to be more aware of that. God rewards the faithful. Again, Abraham is an example of unwavering faith. What else can you think of besides Guy? Richard. Okay. Eh, Right. Okay. Yeah, and I think the idea of him having a house that even allows us to come into his presence. You're right. To approach him shows this amazing love of God, uh, rather than just be this austere God with it's just untouchable. I've created you. You messed up. You're on your own. I mean, if that were the case, we're all hopeless and helpless without anything. Um, Go ahead.
Every one of his heroes have moments where they are zeros and
Right.
they totally wrong.
Yeah.
And yet God used them. And if I totally wrong for that, guess what? I might have a chance.
Okay.
Tomorrow might be a day.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and you might have a grandchild, so you can start again. So, uh, but there, I mean, really, there's what I want you to do when you think about that. I mean, again, to look at these because it's amazing events that happen on mountains. So next week we're going to look at Mount Sinai, which you should be familiar with, and Mount Nebo, which you're probably not as familiar with. So we're going to look at that next week. Do the same kind of format. I appreciate you guys talking and helping out this evening. So we're all done.